Hey everyone! In this video you'll learn some useful vocabulary and expressions that are commonly used in everyday conversations. Let's go!
My name is Inspector Charles Darklight, and I want to tell you about the most difficult case of my career. It was a murder mystery that stayed unsolved for over 20 years. The case changed my life, and at one point, it almost ended it. It all began on a cold November night in 2003 in East London. Cindy Stanford, a 28-year-old teacher, was found dead in her flat. Cindy was loved by her students and respected by her neighbors, but someone had taken her life in the most violent way. I was one of the first officers to arrive at the scene. Her flat was small and tidy, but the living room looked like a battlefield. The coffee table was broken, a lamp had been smashed, and there were bloodstains on the wall. Cindy's body was on the floor, and a scarf was tied tightly around her neck. The coroner later told us that was how she had been killed, strangled with that scarf. We also found other clues. There were muddy footprints leading from the front door to her body. A broken vase lay near her hand, and we guessed she had tried to use it to defend herself. There was a cup of tea on the kitchen counter, still warm, which suggested Cindy had known her killer and let them in. We started the investigation by questioning the people closest to her. Cindy's boyfriend, Mark Evans, was our first suspect. Neighbors told us they had heard them arguing many times before. Mark said he had been at a pub with friends that night, but his alibi wasn't very strong. Then there was her landlord, Peter Hargrove. He was known for being a bit strange, especially with his female tenants. Peter said he hadn't been near the flat that evening, but we found his fingerprints on the broken vase. When we asked him about it, he claimed he had touched it weeks earlier while fixing something in the flat. Lastly, we spoke to Cindy's best friend, Anna Lawson. Anna was upset and crying when we questioned her, but her story didn't completely add up. She said she had been at home watching TV alone that night, but there was no one to confirm her alibi. For weeks, we followed leads, but none of them led to a clear answer. The DNA we collected from the scarf and the fingerprints didn't match anyone in the system. The case went cold, and Cindy's family was left without justice. Years passed, but I never forgot Cindy. Her case file stayed on my desk, a reminder of the work we had left unfinished. Then, in 2024, everything changed. Advances in forensic science allowed us to reanalyze the DNA we had collected from the scarf. This time, we found a match. The DNA belonged to Ross Reynolds, a construction worker who had been arrested years earlier for a minor offense. Ross denied everything when we brought him in for questioning. He claimed he had never met Cindy and had no idea why his DNA was on the scarf. But as we dug deeper, we discovered Ross had worked on a building project near Cindy's flat around the time of her death. He had no clear alibi for the night she was killed. We arrested Ross, but I knew the case wasn't over yet. Something about his story didn't feel complete. While I was working on the case, strange things started happening. One night, I was driving home when another car suddenly hit mine. My car spun out of control and crashed into a tree. Luckily, I escaped with only minor injuries, but I knew it wasn't an accident. Someone wanted me dead. The next day, my flat was broken into. Papers from Cindy's case file, which I had been reviewing at home, were missing. This wasn't just about Ross. Someone else didn't want the truth to come out. I became more determined than ever to solve the case. I started looking into Ross's connections and found something surprising. Ross had been in contact with Peter Hargrove, Cindy's landlord, in the weeks before her death. Phone records showed multiple calls between them. The trial for Ross Reynolds began in 2025. The prosecution presented the DNA evidence, testimonies from neighbors who had seen Ross near Cindy's flat, and expert analysis of the scarf. The jury listened carefully as the evidence was laid out. The defense, however, argued that the DNA didn't prove Ross had killed Cindy. His lawyer suggested the scarf could have been used by someone else after Ross had touched it. The trial lasted several weeks, and I attended every session. I could see Cindy's family in the courtroom, hoping for justice after all these years. During the trial, new evidence came to light. It turned out that Peter Hargrove had been paying Ross under the table for odd jobs around his properties. One witness claimed to have seen Ross and Peter arguing outside Cindy's flat just days before her murder. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, the foreman announced the verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree. Ross was sentenced to life in prison without parole. But even with Ross behind bars, I couldn't shake the feeling that Peter had played a bigger role than we could prove. He had connections to the victim, the suspect, and the crime scene. Unfortunately, without solid evidence, we couldn't charge him. As for the attempts on my life, they stopped after Ross's conviction. Was it Ross or someone connected to him? I may never know. This case taught me that justice is never simple. It takes time, persistence, and sometimes, risking everything to uncover the truth. Cindy Stanford may be gone, but her story reminds me why I do this job: to fight for those who can no longer fight for themselves.
Useful vocabulary: murder, unsolved, investigation, crime scene, coroner. Lead, cold case, forensic science, match, trial. Strangled, clues, alibi, fingerprints, DNA. Prosecution, defense, evidence, verdict, guilty. Sentence, parole, witness, deliberate, break-in. Attempted murder, connections, suspicious, justice, risk. Motive, autopsy, homicide, perpetrator, witness testimony. Interrogation, surveillance, crime scene, conviction, suspicion. Detective, case file, interrogator, prosecutor, courtroom. Jury, trial lawyer, defense attorney, appeal, life sentence. Important phrases. There were bloodstains on the wall. She had been strangled with that scarf. We found his fingerprints on the broken vase. His alibi wasn't very strong. Advances in forensic science. The trial lasted several weeks. The verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Justice may take time, but it's worth every second.